Hello everybody, welcome back to Find My Past Live. Today we are doing a house history discussion and we are very excited about it. And I'm not alone today, which is fantastic. I am joined by Alex Cox. Hello Alex.
Hello, hello.
Our very own PR manager. My name is Ellie. I run social media for Findmypast, and we also have two very special guests with us. If you joined us back in May and June, you may have been watching House Through Time. We had special guests Melanie Backe-Hansen and Professor Deborah Sugg Ryan with us, and I'm delighted to say that they are joining us again today. So hello, both of you.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us again. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, and thank you everybody for joining. Deborah, why don't you start off and just introduce yourself a little bit to anybody that maybe doesn't know you?
Okay, so my name is Professor Deborah Sugg Ryan, and I am a design historian. I work for the University of Portsmouth, and for many, many, many years I have been researching and writing books about the history of the home and the history of houses. And I am also the series consultant for House Through Time, and I appear in every episode talking about architecture, design, and all the objects that are in houses. So that's my kind of particular specialism.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Deborah. And over to you, Melanie.
Yes, well, I am Melanie Beckhamson. I'm a freelance house historian, so effectively that means I take private commissions, largely from homeowners, and just essentially researching the history of their houses, either for short reports or just quick overviews, all the way through to complete books on the history of a house. And that's everywhere from London to Lincolnshire to Cornwall to wherever. Alongside that, I was also the research consultant for A House Through Time. So sadly, I didn't appear on screen, but I was doing a lot of helping the research team in the background, helping them piece together the stories and finding the evidence for the stories. And alongside that, I've just recently written the book that accompanies the series with David Olusoga, which is aptly named A House Through Time.
Fantastic. Well, both of you are very eminent in your field, and yeah, as I said, it's just a pleasure that for us that you could join us today. And Alex, I think we've been doing these live streams since March. I think this is the first time we've appeared on the same one.
Oh wow, it is. Wow, indeed. Is there another better reason to be here? And I was just going to say it's so great to have you both on, because there's never been a better time to do your house history. We're all stuck indoors. Many of us are doing home renovation. If you've been staring, I've been staring at my own four walls, thinking, yeah, I should actually look into this flat. Haven't done that yet, but we've one of the great things it's not a great thing, but one of the positive outcomes of lockdown seems to be that it's led a lot of people to start questioning their roots and actually putting some time aside to do some digging, and I think the same goes for house history. The few guides we do have up on the site seem to be very popular at the moment, so I'm sure we'll have loads of eager viewers with plenty of questions. And that's just what I quickly wanted to say to everybody. Depending on how we get on for time, we will try our best to answer some questions live. So if you have questions for any of us, mainly directed at Mel and Deborah, please do pop them in the comments, and we will try our best to read some of them out.
Brilliant. Yeah, so what are we discussing today? We are talking about house history. We're going to be chatting about why house history is important, why it's fun, about Melanie and Deborah's favourite aspects of house history as well. In addition, a little bit about A House Through Time, because I'm sure a lot of you have watched that. If you haven't, it's well worth a watch. And we're also, as Alex said, going to be answering some of your questions near at the end. But before we start, we wondered, Alex and I have got Zoom virtual backgrounds, and we wondered whether anybody could guess where we are. So answers in the comments. Melanie and Deborah, did you maybe want to take a guess?
I know Ellie's background, although having said that, I've forgotten the name of the house. I'm just trying to think. I recognize it and I know it, but I off the top of my head, I can't remember the name, but I actually don't recognise Alex's background.
What about you, Deborah?
Yeah, I am pretty stumped. I want to see Alex's again, actually. I have to say so. I don't know yours, so I'm going to leave that one to Mel. Alex, let's have a look at yours again.
Yeah, I've probably cheated a little bit in that I've gone for quite an old photograph. This is one that I think was taken in the 20s or 30s.
Yeah.
I can give you a clue. It was, it's where I grew up. It's found on the Wirral. It was lived in by quite a famous family. I think you probably could call them industrialists, I guess. And one more clue, they started a company that is still going strong to this day.
Oh, I think I might have some ideas, but
we've got a couple of guesses in the comments for mine, and both guesses so far are correct. So it is Highclere Castle, also known as Downton Abbey.
I was going to say it's the Downton Abbey house, but I didn't want to say that.
And no guesses for yours, Alex. So yours must be much more obscure than mine. So why don't you put Melanie and Deborah and our audience?
Well, I was going to say, is Alex's anything to do with soap?
It is. Got it in one.
Yes, yes. So Port Sunlight.
Yep, that is where it can be found. It is Fort Manor, the family,
yes.
The Beckhamson family, Lord Beckhamson himself. It's an amazing building.
Brilliant. I don't think we had any more guesses, but hello everybody. There's lots of you coming in the comments. As I said, if you do have a question about house history, or you'd like to pick Deborah or Melanie's brains about house history, pop it in the comments and we'll get to those a little bit later on. So let's have a chat about house history in general, because I mean, I'm not a house historian by trade. Alex, you're not a house historian by trade, but we do have an interest in it. Am I right?
Yeah, I describe myself as an enthusiast, nowhere near an expert.
And there's just, I don't quite know what it is about house history that makes it so relatable. I don't know, Deborah, why don't you start us off on that? Why do you think, why is it so fascinating for so many of us?
Well, I guess an awful lot of us live in older houses. You know, our new housing stock in the UK is relatively small. So, I mean, I've had the experience of living in a brand new house, but I've mainly lived in older houses. And I guess when you move into a house, there are always traces of the previous occupants through the decor. The classic thing is layers of wallpaper, and I think lots of people have had that experience of stripping off some wallpaper and seeing some layers underneath, or finding little traces of previous owners. So I think that that's what's so fascinating, is that so many of us live with the kind of ghosts of previous occupants of houses. And I also think house history is very relatable as well. You know, it's something that most of us encounter, that home sort of defines us. So I think that for me is partly why the fascination comes from, is just that fundamental question of who lived in my house before me.
Absolutely. There is, I like what you said about sort of the ghosts of the people who were there before, because they do leave traces, don't they? My mum has a house from the 1920s, and as again, you say with the wallpaper, you just peel it back and you keep going and you keep going, or you pull up your carpet or your floorboards and you just see tiny little clues underneath. I just think it's brilliant. Are you of the same mind, Melanie?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, it's, as Deborah's explained, I think it's we have an attachment to our home. So whether you rent or own, you live in a space and you make it your own. It's your personal space, and to have a connection with whoever's lived there before you. So whether that's, I don't know, even if it's a 1960s place and you're thinking, well, who were the first people post Second World War to move into this house, or whether it's, you know, the 1660s and actually you're in the middle of the Civil War and what was going on in the area, and actually it's just that always sounds a bit cliche, but it is a door into the past, and actually there's this connection we have where we personally inhabit a space, but we have that connection, and we wonder, you know, who slept in these rooms, and what life was like in this house, or what was it like before there were any kitchens, and how did people, you know, cook their dinners in this place, or, you know, all the little inklings of personal life. And actually it's because we have that personal connection that we wonder how our sort of ancestors had that personal connection in the same exact space that we're inhabiting. So yeah, it's a wonderful way of looking at the past.
Yeah, I completely agree. I suppose it's a little bit like, I don't know if any of you get this feeling, but if you go to a historic home, whether it's a stately home or a castle or somewhere where kings and queens have walked the halls, I think the example for me is Amboise in France, and there's a chateau or a castle right at the top of the hill, and there's a door frame where a French king hit his head, and that actually killed him, and you can actually see that door frame. And okay, yes, these are kings and queens and great men and women, etc., but we can do exactly the same thing with our own homes, with everyday people who have lived in our houses before us. And I just think there's something quite poignant about thinking, how did they live here? What was life like for them? What do you think, Alex?
It's archaeology anybody can do, really, isn't it? I mean, I don't know whether that's oversimplifying it, but even if you live in a relatively new build, the land that house sits on will have been inhabited for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. And you know, my parents' house is Victorian. We found so many shards of pottery. We found very, very, very old garden gnome heads that looked like they were quite creepy to find, actually, but still fascinating. And you know, all these items I'd find playing in the garden as a child. And as I got older and started working from my past, now I know exactly who lived in that house, built in 1898. I know. So I have a rough idea who perhaps cherished these garden gnomes or smashed these plates. I love it. It's fascinating.
I suppose that leads me nicely into my next question for you all, which was going to be, I mean, I'm sure you have all researched the history of your homes, but maybe you could share some of your experiences while doing that. Deborah, why don't you kick us off with that? I mean, I know you've been working on the house you've been in since you moved in, because you wrote a wonderful blog post for us and you shared some pictures. I wondered if you could maybe elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, I recently published a book about interwar homes. The interwar period is so interesting because it's the period in Britain where we became a nation of homeowners, and home ownership started to become accessible to ordinary people on better off working class incomes and lower middle incomes. So I no longer live in that house, sadly, but I did a great deal of research about it, and living in the house and restoring it has been really key to my understanding of that period. So I bought this house back in 1995, very typical 3-bedroom semi-detached house, quite small, in a place called Wolvercurtain in North Oxford. And when we bought it, very, very unusually, it was a deceased estate. It's the kind of house that go viral now, actually, on social media, because it was like a time capsule. It had only ever been decorated once. It only had one electric socket in the whole house, and it was lived in by a family from when it was new. It was built in 1934. So I was very lucky because I had this absolute time capsule, and I could see what it looked like, because it had changed so little. So it had linoleum on the floor that wasn't fitted to the edges of the room. It had all its original furniture, which we bought with the house. I don't think the owners, the sale was being dealt with by one of the grandchildren of the original family. And it was really talking to the vendors of the house. And then of course they lived a few doors down, so they became my neighbours, and I got to know them quite well. So I was very lucky in being able to find out the story of the people who lived in the house. So I had been told that they were first-time homeowners from quite modest backgrounds, and that Vernon Collett, the gentleman of the house, worked at the paper mill in Oxford, which made paper for Oxford University Press's books. And then I took to doing genealogical research and found out a lot more about them, about their family backgrounds, about their children, and the fact that this represented a kind of huge transformation in their lives to become homeowners, but and also a very new way of living in a home of their own as well. And it's a story we cover a lot in House Through Time, about houses being overcrowded and multiple occupation, and this kind of transformation in the 30s or the 20s and the 30s is so dramatic when people have these opportunities. And of course we mustn't forget as well, this is also the time of social housing too, so lots of people had opportunities to move into houses built by local authorities. So, and that really impacts on people's health. One of the things we know is that women started having access to information from people like Marie Stopes. They limit their family size, partly because of their kind of consumer aspirations. And if you're going to fit into this small house, maybe you don't want too many children. So one of the things I think is so fascinating is that social history and our houses and economic history are so interconnected. So we just get this kind of window into this kind of bigger history, but that's also very relatable as well. So that for me was, the start of a bit of an obsession, but it was as important to me to look at the actual structure of the house and all the things that had survived. They were as important to me as the kind of written records. So I was intensely interested in things like their choice of colours on the wall, lino on the floor, all those kinds of things as well.
It's brilliant. Like, you've clearly gone into so much detail researching this the house's history, which is just incredible. And I suppose some people might say that it's a post-war. I know, was it a post-war?
Interwar, 1934. Yeah.
Some people might not think that's that old, and they might not think there's much history there, but there's still so much to uncover. So if you live in an interwar home, everybody listening at home, remember there's still lots to find. Melanie, have you researched your home or any of your previous homes at all?
I have to admit I haven't fully researched my home. I actually live in a converted late Victorian house in London. I've done snippets. I have discovered a few details, but largely sort of 1880s period, and by the 1890s I was curious to find that even though it's quite a large house, but it's West London, basically after the underground is built through parts of London, there was massive explosion of housing, literally street upon street of Victorian housing. But quite soon after it was built, it was already divided into two families, which I found quite interesting, as one sort of central householder and then a separate. And I've never quite worked out how they did it, and whether there is a side door, and was that an extra, that it now goes to a kitchen. But so I've always tried to work out how they did that, or actually it was one front door, and the second householder would have gone to rooms upstairs. But interestingly, I found the second householder was a retired Austrian general who was about 80 something years old, and his wife was about 30 something years old. So that brought up a whole lot of questions about what on earth is going on. Who is this man and what is he doing? So, and he was I should have brought out my notes, but he was a von something. So there's clearly some interesting stories in his background. Sadly, I haven't had the chance to sort of delve further into his story, but yeah, so that was quite a story. And interestingly, near me was this part of West London was covered in country houses before the underground, and there was a few dotted around, and one of which is called Munster House, and actually gave its name to Munster Road, which is quite well known in West London area here. But the Munster House had become an asylum for it was gentlemen, asylum for gentlemen, and that's so of course a private asylum for rather than going to the horrendous workhouse asylum or anything quite like that. But I was telling my housemates all about this asylum, and they're like, oh my God, you know. So, okay, I've done snippets of our house, but still quite a few stories to unravel. But there's also loads in the area. So I've had some fun, and I found an old photograph of the old house that became an asylum and all sorts. So yeah, now the side of a Tesco on the corner of Munster Road. So so yeah, there's all sorts you can unravel, even if, yeah, as you've been saying, you know, like even if your house isn't that old, there's a lot of history you can unravel even in the nearby area. So there's lots to find.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. You know, say your particular house isn't that old, but you can still research what the area looked like, whether you use old photographs, newspapers, old maps. Yeah. There's something quite special about looking, especially like your hometown, for example. Like I'm from North Wales, and seeing how the area I grew up in evolved, say from when the railway came, I think in 1848, the town just suddenly expanded. And looking at that on maps is quite fascinating. And I must admit, I've not really done much on the history of my childhood home. I once looked into a property my sister lived at when she was at university. She lived in the Georgian Quarter in Liverpool. And yeah, so we found that it used to be a boarding house, and that I think at one point it was connected to the cathedral, because it was near to the cathedral. And I remember when we were doing that, my sister and I, we stayed up until about 2 or 3 in the morning researching it, because we were just, I think we were hooked at that point.
Yeah,
Alex,
I was just gonna say, that's, you know, I've always found really interesting, because I spend so much time looking at other people's houses and other people's family trees more than my own, but how the kind of changing fortunes of different local areas. So like where I am now, Twickenham, you know, some of the little 2-bedroom terrace houses on the high street now are you know, now kind of professional homes for people kind of on upper income brackets. But being when I've been looking at the 1901 census, these same properties are lived in by, you know, street sweepers, and like just completely other end of the social spectrum. And like when I used to live in Liverpool as well, I used to live on the edge of Toxteth, and in Toxteth you had all these spectacular, I guess you could call them like merchant palaces, you know, big 4-story Georgian homes built by all the merchants making their money in the Liverpool docks. And you could look at them and then picture what they would have been like in their glory days. But of course, by the time I was living there, Toxteth was not, let's just say, not the nicest part of the city, but it's still lovely. But yeah, no, I just find that fascinating, how demographics of areas can change so dramatically while properties stay pretty similar. It's great.
It's an interesting point, actually, because I've heard from archivists that they quite often get asked things like, they find where their ancestor lived in, you know, the 1861 census or something, and then they go and ask, oh, well, what was this house like then? And if you look at a modern Google Maps, or you walk down the street and you think, oh, that's a very nice house. Oh, that's quite lovely. But actually, it's had a tumultuous story, as the houses in A House Through Time have shown. They may have started as these lovely single family gentlemen's residents, wealthy merchants, but then they go up and down, up and down. So actually in 1861, it might have been, yeah, multiple occupancy divided into separate flats, you know. So it's an interesting question about how our houses have changed as well. So, and how the areas around the house can change.
Absolutely. I suppose that leads us nicely on to our next segment. And Alex, I'm going to hand over to you for this.
Of course. So, is this favorite aspects of it, essentially? What is it particularly about researching properties that brings you the most joy? What actually let's go to the beginning. What got you started, and then what hooked your interest? Whoever wants to.
Shall I start? Sorry, I wasn't sure if that was directed at someone, but I actually started in a slightly unusual way. I studied history at university, but I first started researching the history of houses when I was employed by an estate agent, purely to unravel the history of houses to help promote them for the market. which actually works brilliantly. And a lot of people say to me, why don't estate agents do that more often now? But yeah, I was employed purely to research the histories and unravel brilliant stories and find, you know, all sorts that would help promote the history of a house, and ultimately to sell the house. So that's how I first got started, which is a little bit unique. Most people get into it slightly differently to that. But from the start, I've always loved it, and it is very much the social history. So, you know, a lot of people look at the architectural history, which is important, but I think what's becoming more fun and interesting with studying the history of houses or researching them is the social history. It's finding out the stories of the people and actually unraveling their stories, and that's what sort of gained the most attention through the program, and why people are picking up doing it themselves. So that's my passion as well. I actually genuinely love the social history, trying not to get too distracted by certain stories and running off down avenues of research and trying to find out who that person was. And but it's easily done. But yeah, it's, you know, looking through old newspapers or census returns, or I don't know, old deeds, and finding all sorts of references to people and their stories, and old wills where you've got family members being disinherited because they had an illegitimate child, and then this, you know, and actually it's all through just the steps involved with researching the history of a house. So it's definitely revealing the personal stories, and so many of them are not recorded. It's those stories of seemingly ordinary people, or, you know, they're not generals in the military, they're not aristocracy, but actually they lived normal lives, but actually they themselves could have had extraordinary stories, but they're not necessarily recorded in a lot of ways. So yeah, that always gets me going. It's unraveling all those personal stories.
What about you, Deborah?
Yeah, my route into it is also, I guess, slightly unusual. So I originally trained as an art historian, and we didn't learn a lot about design or architecture when I trained. And then I joined the V&A as a curator. And when I worked for the V&A, I became really interested in design, and I ended up working in wonderful Blythe House, which is where the V&A's Archive of Art and Design is. They're just in the process of vacating it, along with the other London museums who use it as a store, but it's been used a lot for film sets. So Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was on recently. Fantastic. It was the headquarters of the Post Office Savings Bank. And one of my jobs as a very junior curator, and this is right back in the late 80s, was to unpack archives as they arrive. And I had been thinking about design, and I'd been learning about design. And a lot of what I'd been learning about design was about design with a capital D, and, you know, the kind of design for posh people, basically, expensive design by designers. And there hadn't been so much attention paid to the ordinary and the everyday. And I had kind of really struggle to start finding things that made a sense of the kind of background I come from, which is this, you know, kind of working class background with people gradually moving up the social scale. And one day some archives arrived, and I opened the first box, and these were photo albums documenting the Ideal Home exhibition, which I'm sure lots of people watching have been to. Very interesting to think about what's happening to it now. It was founded in 1908, the longest continuously running trade exhibition in the world. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And these were albums of press photos, and I literally opened the box, picked one out, opened it up, and I just thought, wow, this is what I'm going to write about. I've been thinking of leaving the museum and doing a PhD, and for me, what this was doing was telling the story of ordinary houses. I mean, they are the ideal, but they very much document the way we live in Britain. So that was the first time that I started really getting into writing about houses and interiors, and it was really my route into thinking of people in houses was thinking about people's interaction with designed objects or not designed objects as they may be, everyday objects. So I'm really interested in all the stuff that surrounds us. At the moment, I'm writing a history of the kitchen, so I'm thinking about all our kitchen equipment, and you can't talk about objects without talking about the people that use them. And what there had been in design history at the point I started writing was quite a lot of emphasis on designers and producers and a bit of emphasis on retailers, but not so much thinking about the interaction of people with stuff. So that's what kind of got me going into house history. And when I was writing the book on the interwar home, which took me a very long time, I stopped and started over many, many years for various quite complicated reasons, is once I started looking at individual houses, I started then wanting to know more about the people that lived in them. So I came at it from design, and I'm still very interested in what our choices about design tell us about the way we live. There's been an outpouring this week in the press about Terence Conran dying, and thinking about his history as a retailer, thinking about the history of Habitat, which he founded, really tells us something about the way we live and the way how we lived has changed. So I don't think you can separate people from houses and things and interiors. They're all very interconnected.
Well, it certainly looks like people agree with us. We've had loads of comments in. The questions have been flying in thick and fast as well. But loads of people basically just sharing lovely examples of exactly the kind of things we have been talking about, finding all kinds of weird and wonderful things while rooting through cupboards. I just saw one before that I want to try and find. It was fantastic. Looks like I've lost it, so we'll just go for some random. So Jackie Nesbitt said she was researching a distant. Oh, I think that's a question. We will leave that one. Yeah, someone Joe Tuff saying there's still an air raid shelter in the garden next door, and apparently their house had a large red cross painted on the front of it during World War II. Do you know what would that be for medical treatment or strange one? Also, my favourite one. Someone recently had an envelope arrive at their house, which apparently was sent in 1913, and there was a note on the back saying apologies, no forward address or something. And they're wondering if there's any way they could possibly track down the descendants of the family that were living in that home and then pass that letter forwards, which it was Sadia, that was it, Sadia, yeah. Sadia, that is an amazing story. If you're still listening, I would love it if you'd get in touch with us, testimonials@findmypast.com. Love to hear about that story. Anything you can do to help you with that.
I should say, actually, that is possible, because actually a former client of mine, I was researching her house in Surrey, built in the 1920s, and they were renovating it just recently and found an old letter from a former occupant that was probably more like the 1980s, so slightly different. But actually they found it tucked away behind a panel in the wall. And actually through the research, through my unraveling the story about who lived in the house, we actually found it was the young boy, and he was living with his parents at the time. He's now obviously grown up, but they reconnected and she delivered the letter back to him. So actually, yeah, now they're in touch, they're in contact, and it's a beautiful story. So it is possible to, I mean, granted that was slightly more recently, but it's doable.
Yeah, I'm quite shocked receiving a postcard from 1913.
Yeah.
But that sounds doable, doesn't it? 1911 census, street directories, that sounds entirely doable, actually, to find that fact. They're the kind of places we would look. And the wonderful British newspaper archive as well is also you often get fantastic stories about occupants of houses there. So that sounds to me perfectly possible that they could trace the person the descendants of the people that letter is to. So and I am always, I own a lot of family trees on Find My Past from people who I'm not connected with, but I'm interested in them because of the houses they lived in or things that they did, because it's all part of the kind of bigger picture. So yeah, I want to know about that story. I think we're onto something there.
Well, I want to hear about it as well.
The fingers crossed. we hear more, and loads of people quite a few people saying they found dumb waiters in old blocks of flats they lived in when they were students. One lucky viewer actually, while doing some home renovation at the back down the back of an old cupboard, found an envelope containing the deeds dating all the way back to the 1870s, listing every sale of the properties.
Oh.
So your job's done.
That's gold dust. That's gold dust, definitely. Yeah, that's brilliant.
That leads me on to, I mean, we can't have you both on without talking about the wonderful show, A House Through Time. I know we've referenced it a few times, but I've also seen that quite a few viewers are watching in the US, so they might be scratching their heads thinking, what is A House Through Time? Well, if you haven't seen it before and you're watching in the US, it's fantastic. It's basically, who do you think you are for houses? But I guess I should probably leave it to you two to do it a little bit more justice than that.
Yeah,
I mean, how to describe it in 2 sentences?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it does is it takes a single house, and through telling the story of everyone, or as many people as we can fit into 4 episodes who live in it, it allows us to tell a kind of bigger social history of that place. Sometimes histories are very specific to the specific city, but sometimes we get into kind of bigger national themes or even international themes. So those of you who, for viewers from other countries who haven't seen it yet, the last series was set in Bristol, and quite extraordinarily, you know, when we made the series, we knew in Bristol we were very likely to find a house with a connection to the slave trade, which is indeed what we did. And quite extraordinarily, the BBC had kind of hung on to broadcasting it, I think, because, you know, they were rationing their programmes a bit with COVID, and we got delayed and delayed and delayed. And episode 1, which was all about the house's connection with its original owner in the slave trade, went out the week before the extraordinary toppling of the Colston statue. And, you know, its timeliness was extraordinary. And I think for lots of our viewers, it really brought home how intertwined our everyday history is with that broader history of the British Empire, the colonies, and the slave trade as well. So, you know, through the kind of microscopic focus on a single house, you can get at these much bigger stories. But I also think by telling those stories through individuals, through ordinary people, it means that viewers become very invested in them, and it makes them very human. And so something that might seem quite abstract, we really start delving into it once we start finding out about these individual stories that we can relate to, but also become more sort of universal. So it's as if you sort of zoom in and zoom out and back again. I think that's what the house does for you.
And it's, wow, I hope you can answer this, but is that kind of what, is that something that's factored in when you're, so different series are in different locations, but is that something that is factored in when you're on the hunt for properties? Are you looking specifically in areas where you I guess you can't predict what you're going to find, but do you try and make predictions based on any kind of geography?
Well, I think the intention with Bristol, very much one of the reasons we went to Bristol is because, you know, we went to that particular bit of the city was because of those connections. And our presenter, David Olusuga, he was very instrumental in saying, this is the story I want to tell. You know, there are other bits of Bristol we could have gone to, but the fact that we went to this quarter by the docks where the merchants lived. So often what the production company is doing is they've got some ideas beforehand of the kinds of stories they might want to tell, and usually they settle on a kind of region of the city and do some leafleting to get people interested. You know, would you literally drop leaflets through doors? Now, we haven't been able to do this because of coronavirus for the forthcoming series, so there's slightly different methods this time, but that's how it's gone from, and we eventually come up with a kind of short list that is researched initially in some depth. I have to say, usually 3 or 4 houses are researched. I know Mel has been involved when they've, you know, we hit the particular brick walls, as you know, we're all used to that term, aren't we, now in these circles? But Yeah, so we have some ideas, but often it surprises us. But what we want to find is a house that has had a lot of changes in residence. And, you know, one of the things I think that lots of us say as well, happy people don't necessarily make dramatic stories as well.
All my favourite ancestors lived utterly miserable lives, and I don't know why. There's something just more compelling about that. It's bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah, but you could, you know, of course you can't anticipate, you know, often we are very, very surprised by the stories that we find as well. And I know, you know, Mel has been very involved in uncovering some of those.
Well, and actually that leads me very nicely to a question for you, Mel, and I think this might answer some of the questions that people are actually asking in the comments. So what on the subject of brick walls, really, what would you say the most common challenges you face that could potentially derail the whole process, and how would you try and get around them when you hit them?
Well, there's probably quite a few. At the moment, I know I'm helping the team because they're a little bound by some of the closures. You know, lockdown has meant that all the archives are closed. So obviously there's a certain amount of research you can do using Findmypast and some online repositories and things. But so at the moment they're sort of looking at a number of stories, but they're limited in a lot of ways by the online sources. So in some ways it's sort of trying to go around the houses to try and find some different avenues to get at the stories. I mean, ultimately they will need to head to the archives to get to some of the original documents, but there are ways of doing it, and it's just particularly for the earlier parts of the histories, because obviously 20th century history, a lot of it is available online. You've got things like the 1939 register, the 1911 census, electoral registers, directories, maps, and even for the 19th century, you've got all the census returns and other sort of occupational records for those. So there's, you know, they can get a certain amount, but it's actually delving into the story, you know, the nitty gritty of some of the stories, which that's where it gets a bit tricky, but it's doable. And that's where actually house history starts crossing over into genealogy, because you're, as Deborah said, that actually it's the people stories, and actually it's finding out who they were. So whether actually they're finding the name of someone, but actually when you first find someone's name written in a directory or newspaper article, you might not know who they are. So actually it's then taking their name and delving a bit further into their story and who they were and what occupation did they have and what was their family situation. And so there's certain things you can delve into. So, but it's, yeah, sometimes probably one of the biggest challenges is actually the lack of evidence, because actually it just doesn't survive. Actually, that's the same across the country. You know, you could, you know, that person that found their deeds wrapped up in a parcel, that's brilliant, hold on to those, that's gold. But in a lot of cases with some houses, you don't, the deeds have long gone, and there's gaps in the records. So that's where you start having to become a bit more of a detective, and you're having to piece together lots of different sources to fill in the gaps and actually piece together people's stories and how the story of the house unravels. So yeah.
It really is casting the net wide and hoping that it all comes together.
Yeah.
But if I get a question for both of you, if both of you could list, I don't know, 3 essential resources that are core to doing your jobs that you simply couldn't do without, what would they be? And it's up to you who goes first.
Well, I'll jump in there. I mean, for me, the 1939 register, because it is where I start, you know, and especially, you know, for the period I mean, ironically, when I wrote my book on the interwar home, when I wrote the first edition, it hadn't been digitized, but I did a revised edition with a new introduction, and it allowed me, because the publisher asked me to write a new introduction, it allowed me to go back to the stories I told of individual houses and have a look at them in the 1939 register. But it is, you know, it is the most recent source we have in lots of ways, and it's full of lots of additional information as well, which is incredibly useful, because it was used to help set up records when the NHS was set up. For example, it often has women's married names in it, and I have been doing some biographical research recently about a gay woman who was an actress, theatre producer and pageant master called Gwen Lally. And it's been incredibly difficult. It's always really difficult with same-sex relationships to trace partners. And what's made it even more difficult for her partner is that she was known by different names. And sometimes she called herself Mabel, sometimes she's called herself Amable. And what's extraordinary, I went back to the register this week because I was doing some more work on because I'm hoping this is going to become a biography. In the 1939 registers, Mabel crossed out, Amable crossed out, crossed out in red, Amable, then the red is crossed out, and then in green, Amable, Mabel. So this is obviously, you know, and I had terrific problems tracing her, and I was very, very fortunate. In the end, I found a family member, a descendant. But what's extraordinary is her birth certificate says Mabel, her probate record says Amable, and she married, and of course she's known by her married name. So if I hadn't have got to the family member, I don't know how I ever would have found her maiden name, because I had a real job finding a marriage certificate. So, you know, it's really interesting. And so, you know, this particular research is a nice example, because 1939 register, and then sometimes it's the completely random, you know, thing that is the breakthrough. So the big breakthrough for this particular piece of research was in frustration typing both their names into Google after I put the research down and came back to it for a while, and finding a painting for sale in an auction catalogue, inscribed on the back from Mabel to Amable. And I got in touch with the auctioneer and said the provenance said it's from the family, and they put me in touch with a great niece who then she had a copy of the birth certificate, a copy of the marriage certificate, and lots of photographs and lots of stuff that she's very kindly shared with me. So sometimes the good old Google search is really, really good. So that's my second tip. And then my third thing is for me, for house history, it is the documentary evidence of the house itself. You know, for me is really, really important to me because of the kind of historian I am. So I am always looking for those wallpaper samples and things like that. And my best source for that is a source that deserves to be much, much better known, the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture, which is an archive. It's not actually a museum, it's an archive owned by Middlesex University, and it has a really wonderful website. You can make an appointment when they're open again to visit, and it is particularly good for things like wallpaper. It started as the Silver Studio wallpaper collection, but it also has things like estate agents' brochures, furniture trade catalogues, domestic advice manuals, and it's really wonderful if you want to kind of think about what did my house look like. It's really good for fleshing that out. So, you know, that's for me a really, really important source.
And what about you, Mel? Are you able to list off three in?
Yeah, to limit it to three is quite tricky. But I would probably go first with it's tricky to narrow it to three, but I will probably go census. You know, for that's sort of following on from Deborah's mention of the 1939 register, but obviously from 1911 back to 1841, the census returns are invaluable for a 19th into 20th century house, because they also, probably the key thing about it is that a lot of other records, they only list the head of the house, so or the eligible voters if it's the electoral registers, but the census return will list everyone in the house on that night, and that includes children, servants, visitors, you know, and everyone. And a lot of other records just don't include that information. So to be able to piece that together every 10 years is a really big, important part of house histories. Probably, I will say this is perhaps a bit of a surprise perhaps to some people, but I would probably go manorial records
Okay.
Mainly because at the moment I'm researching a 16th century house in Essex, and I would not be able to tell the story without the manorial records. Like, it would just be impossible to find the early history of the house. Like, it basically, you know, prior to I think the land tax records give the owner and the occupant in about the late 18th century, so you're talking 1790s, but the house is built in the early 1500s. So there's 250 years of history, which actually there are very few other records in that area to piece together the story. So the manorial records, which is court rolls, it happens that the house was part of the manor, so it's recorded in the court rolls and the court books. And it's helped to unravel some of the history. It's still actually a bit of a puzzle. It's one of those tricky ones. It's right up there with one of my trickiest to research, but you know, it was built in the early 1500s, so that's quite a lot of history to unravel.
That is a lot of history.
Yeah. so particularly for people who are looking at a house that's older, manorial records actually are really important. And they also include so much more, depending on which manor you're looking at. They can include old surveys and plans, rent books. You know, there was a house I researched in Gloucestershire that was built in the 1580s. And the manorial records for that area were brilliant, because actually I was able to piece it all together and then match the ownership records with the occupant. And there were, anyway, it's a long story, but in essence, I was able to trace the owners and the occupants all the way back to the 16th century, which can be rare for some things, so for some houses. So yeah, the manorial records, it sounds scarier than it is if I just put it out there, but they're invaluable for older houses. So I would probably say, actually, third one, maps is probably another key one. Yeah, so as I say, there are lots of other records, but the maps, and there's lots of different types of maps, but they can be just incredible for revealing the history of a house and its location. So and you can, you know, I was doing some research in London recently, and to be able to trace back the location of an outer area of London back to when it was literally a small country village, and actually was surrounded by fields and meadows and woods, and actually to piece together the development of the house and the development of the area. You know, then you've got obviously things like the bomb damage maps, or Charles Booth poverty map, or fire insurance maps. You know, there's parish maps, there's all sorts of maps, and they help. And also it's the visual thing, so you can actually see it. And I think that sometimes when you're looking at a lot of written documents, it's hard to get your head around it, but with maps, obviously it's great to be able to visually see what an area is like, and to perhaps locate your house on a map. So yeah, they're my top three.
Perfectly answered one of the common questions we've been getting in the comments, which is tips for pre-census, because a lot of people obviously are getting back to 1841 and then going, what next?
Yeah.
So, like, to summarize, do you think pre-census your best probably things like rate books?
Yeah, rate books, the tithe map and apportionment is probably the best thing. So actually, if you can find, because the tithe map, not only, it was basically when tithe payment was changing from goods to currency, and they surveyed the area and came up with a value. And so there's a map that gives you the exact house and the details and the parameters of the house and the surrounding land. But then there's a record that gives you the landowner, the occupant, and a description, or brief description, and then the value. So actually, if you found someone on the 1841 census, and then you can also find them on the tithe map, it helps to piece that together. And also you then get the owner. So if you've got the owners recorded on, say, land tax or rate books or things, then you can start taking it back to the 18th century. So yeah, that's probably the first things. Yeah,
because another question, people seem to be having similar issues. So what one viewer said, could you outline the process of pinpointing a resident at any one point in history? I guess that, as we've just discussed, that depends entirely on when you're looking. So yeah, if you're looking between 1939 and 1841, definitely check the censuses. 1832, 1932, electoral registers. prior to that, that's when it gets a bit trickier, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah.
Another question that a lot of people have been asking is advice on, if they don't have them already, is there any way you can track down copies of deeds? Not sure who'd like to take that one.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll quickly answer. You can try, I mean, first of all, you can try land registry. They will have at least a register, the title register, and there may be references to earlier exchanges. But a lot of the land registry details don't go back very far. So the next thing would be actually just head to the county record office in that area where the house is situated, because in a lot of cases you find deeds tucked away in old solicitors' collections, old land ownership collections. If it was part of a manor, then again there might be a whole boxes full of old deeds that were part of the early ownership. So it just depends on the history of the house and its local area and who the early owner was. But yeah, if you can't find any deeds and you've got, you know, if they're not tucked away in a solicitor's office, because you can always check with your mortgage provider, they may have them tucked away somewhere, then head to the county record office.
Brilliant. Well, I think, Ellie, do you think we can squeeze in any more questions, or we're at 57? What do you think?
Are there any more you can see in the comments?
I've mainly complex.
Well, that's my chance to say we get together on Twitter. Yes. Every Thursday at 7 o'clock. So Mel and I and some other leading house historians have a Twitter account called House History Hour, although it's HR for the hour on the House History account because the Twitter limit. But we use the hashtag House History Hour, all one word. So 7 o'clock British time on Thursdays, and we get together for an hour of chat, and we tend to pick a theme for each week. So we have done a week on maps, we've done a week on the 1939 register, we've had all sorts of themes. We publish highlights of the tweets as our wonder Keith, who is part of the group, who has the Trace My House website, publishes our Twitter moments every week, so you can go back and have a look at those. And every few weeks we do a kind of general Q&A thing where you can just ask us questions and we'll give you some advice. So we take it in turns to host it, and it's really lively, and the hour goes extremely fast. And we love it when people ask us questions. We love it when people post us pictures and documents, and usually one of us has an answer, not always, and we just love hearing what people are doing. So I think we'd be very happy for anyone who's tuning in to join us there on Thursdays.
You heard that, guys. Tune in. You will not.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was going to wrap up by saying, if you do have any more questions for Melanie and Deborah, join them on House History Hour on Twitter, 7 o'clock British time. And just, come and ask you questions, come and have a chat with them. They're both very lovely, as you can see from today's discussion as well. I think we're just coming up to the hour, so I think all I've got left to say is thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure to actually host one of these with you for once. And thank you, Melanie and Deborah. When you guys came on last time, we talked about so much, and as we've just said with House History Hour on Twitter, the hour goes so fast. I'm sure we could carry on chatting for another hour or so, but everybody needs to get their dinner. So thank you to everybody. Remember, I've put some comments in with the links to Melanie and Deborah's blog post that they kindly did for us. So if you want any more information, there's some more information in those links there. And also remember, Melanie and Deborah are both published authors, so you can go check out their books as well. Now, tomorrow on Findmypast Live, we have Jen Baldwin back, and she's going to be talking about how to cross the pond from the United States into the UK with your research. And then Alex, I think you're back on Friday for Friday's Live, aren't you?
I am, yes. Topic TBC.
Topic TBC, you heard it here first. Well,
I just
Deborah,
wanted to say to Mel and Deb very quickly that everyone in the comments has been enjoying this thoroughly. You've definitely got a few new followers now. Thank you to everybody for saying such kind things. But yeah, it seems great success. So we'd love to have you on again.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been lovely, and you know, I look forward. Actually, I usually delve into the comments afterwards and have a look at what people have been saying. So I will join in.
Thank you for busy.
Yes, and thank you from me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.